Almost every leader that I meet with says accountability matters in their company. But the more companies that I spend time inside, the more I notice something really important. There are actually different levels of accountability inside of a business. And most companies, they never get past the second one. Hey, welcome back to the Leadership in 5 podcast. I'm James Mayhew, and I want to pick up on that thought that I just dropped in front of you. Because when you look closely, there are actually 4 levels of accountability inside of your business. And most companies never get past the second one. Let's start with the first level. That's the one where the people that I'm working with, they've already moved beyond. And that's punitive accountability. And that's where something breaks or a deadline slips or a mistake is made and someone gets called in to explain themselves. Now, in the worst cultures, it turns into a name, blame, and shame game. And like I said, the leaders that I work with, they're past that. They don't do that. Which leads me to the second level. And that's where most companies think of when they do talk about accountability. I would consider it sort of the conventional approach, which is something goes wrong and afterward we get together to figure out why, what happened, what should we do differently next time, what did we learn? And those are really responsible conversations. In fact, the second question alone is incredibly important. What could we do or what should we do differently next time? Because that question is really the beginning where improvement lies. But notice when those conversations happen, they happen after the mistake, after the deadline is passed, after the outcome is already locked in. And you can learn from it and you can improve the next project, but it doesn't have any impact on the one that just happened. And many companies do that version of accountability actually pretty well. And it leads me then to what I would call the third level. I call it proactive accountability. And it's here when the conversation changes before the work ever begins. The planning conversation is clearer. People leave the rooms knowing exactly what they're responsible for. They know the outcome they're aiming for. They know what success looks like. And ownership then, it becomes a visible thing. And then when the work starts moving, the conversations begin to sound different. Instead of leaders chasing updates, they hear things like, here's where I'm at. Here's what I think could potentially get in the way. Here's what we're doing to stay on track. And at this level, people aren't just reporting activity. They're actually taking responsibility for the outcome, for the results. And don't miss this, even small pockets of proactive accountability inside of a company can dramatically improve your execution. Many organizations would simply transform simply by operating at level 3 consistently. But something interesting happens when a company reaches this point where leaders begin asking a deeper question. If we can clarify ownership before the work begins, and we can talk about progress while the work is unfolding, then why are we still surprised by outcomes after the work ends? And if you've been leading long enough, you've probably seen something else. There's a few people inside your company who seem to see problems forming long before anyone else does. They're the ones that walk into your office and say, something doesn't feel right here. Or if we keep going this direction, this part is probably going to break. They're not guessing. They're reading the situation early, which brings us to the 4th level of accountability. I call it predictive accountability. At this level, the organization begins surfacing reality early enough to change the outcome. Risks, they show up sooner, and patterns from the past start to inform the work before the problems occur. Most companies treat accountability as something that happens after the work is done. But real accountability exists before the work begins, while the work is unfolding, and after the work is complete. That's predictive accountability. And if you've been leading long enough, you know exactly the people in your company who are already operating that way. They're the ones who see things forming before anyone else does. They notice the ripple effects of decisions early. They surface risks before those risks become visible to everyone else. And not every high performer operates this way. The very best ones do. The top guns. The people founders recognize immediately because they kind of think the same way as you do. Predictive accountability creates a system where that level of thinking becomes possible across the entire company, not just inside of a handful of exceptional people. And companies that operate at that level, they don't just hold people accountable. They create growing confidence all the way throughout the business. Confidence in the work, confidence in the commitments, confidence in the numbers, confidence for leaders, teams, and even the financial partners who depend on the organization's performance. And that's because outcomes rarely arrive as surprises. Most organizations say they want accountability, but every step up that ladder raises the standard. And once an organization learns how to see results taking shape while the work is still unfolding, leaders stop managing surprises. They start leading with confidence. Again, that's predictive accountability. And that's just another example of how you can leave it better.